The air was thick with the smell of smoke, mud, and manure, a scent that defined the very heartbeat of medieval village life. The year might have been 1327, though to the peasants tilling the frozen fields, time was measured not by calendars, but by seasons of hunger and brief harvests of hope. Beneath a gray sky, the cottages leaned into one another like weary souls, their walls brown and uneven, their roofs drooping under layers of thatch. These were not the stone manors of nobles or the tiled halls of merchants. These were homes built from earth itself, mud, straw, and the dung of cattle that grazed nearby. For the medieval peasant, survival was an act of endurance. Each winter, the wind cut through villages like a blade, finding every crack and gap in a wall. Stone was expensive, timber was scarce, and jealously guarded by lords who owned the forests. What remained was what nature gave freely: clay from the riverbanks, straw from the fields, and the warm, sticky gift of the cattle that kept them alive. From these humble ingredients, the peasantry built their fortresses, not of marble or might, but of necessity. At dawn, women could be seen kneeling by the pen, scooping fresh dung into wooden buckets, their hands raw but unflinching. Children fetched straw and mixed it with mud, stomping in it until the blend became thick and pliable. The work was messy, unglamorous, and eternal. Yet within this ritual lay an ancient wisdom, passed down through centuries of famine and frost. The peasants knew what the lords never cared to learn: that even the earth's filth, when shaped with patience, could become shelter. Inside these walls of dung and straw, life was not quiet. The crackling of the hearth, the bleating of goats brought inside for warmth, and the creak of wind pressing against the daub made every night feel alive. The smoke from the fire rose upward, curling into blackened rafters where it lingered, staining everything with soot. The smell was strong, an earthy, pungent perfume that clung to clothes, to hair, to skin. Outsiders might have called it unbearable. To those who lived within it, it was simply home. This was the world of the forgotten majority, the peasants who made up more than 90% of medieval Europe's population. They lived close to the soil, their hands always brown with it, their faces hardened by wind and hunger. Yet for all the filth that surrounded them, there was a strange kind of beauty in their world. The rhythm of work, the cooperation of neighbors, the simple triumph of raising walls that could withstand another winter. Every house in the village bore the same signature: the uneven texture of daub pressed by hand, the faint imprint of straw, and the smell of the animals that sustained them. These walls were alive, breathing moisture in the rain and exhaling warmth when the fire burned low. When the sun rose, its light revealed the artistry hidden in simplicity, a patchwork of survival painted in the tones of earth and life. The peasants did not build for beauty or status, they built for endurance. In the eyes of their lords, they were mere tenants, living in huts of filth. Yet within those walls, children laughed, families prayed, and the weary found rest. The dung that others scorned became their armor against the cold, their testimony of resilience. It was not glamour that sustained them. It was the stubborn belief that no matter how humble the material, a home could still be made from it. And so, from the mixture of earth and excrement, of straw and sweat, the peasants built more than just walls. They built a legacy, one that whispered across centuries: when all else is taken, humanity endures, even in the stench of survival. Long before the great cathedrals of Europe reached for heaven, the peasants of the earth had already learned to shape their own kind of permanence. Their craft was called wattle and daub, a humble name for an ingenious system that turned the simplest of materials into sturdy homes. It began with the wattle, a lattice of interwoven wooden sticks, thin branches of hazel or willow bent by hand, forming a crude skeleton of walls. This delicate framework, woven like a basket, was both flexible and strong, able to bend with wind and time rather than break. To modern eyes it might seem fragile, but to the medieval villager it was the backbone of shelter. Once the wattle stood, the true labor began. Buckets of mud were mixed with straw, chaff, and the unmistakable addition of cow dung. Barefoot peasants stomped and churned the blend until it took on the consistency of heavy dough. The dung acted as glue, the straw as reinforcement. Together they created a living mixture that would cling to the wood and harden under the sun. With calloused hands, men and women pressed the daub into the lattice, smearing it with practiced ease. Children, eager to help, splattered handfuls against the frame, laughing as the brown paste oozed between the rods. It was filthy work, but communal. And that was the beauty of it. Everyone took part in the raising of a wall. There was rhythm to the act, almost ceremonial. The sound of slapping mud, the soft squelch beneath feet, the scent of earth mingling with the air. It was a symphony of subsistence. The entire village might gather when a new cottage was built, neighbors lending their strength, each handprint a silent pledge of solidarity. These homes were not mere shelters. They were born of the land and bound by community. Once applied, the daub would dry and crack under the heat of the sun. More layers were added, sometimes mixed with horsehair, ashes, or sand, whatever could be found. To finish, a coat of lime wash was brushed over the surface, giving the walls a ghostly white sheen. It was more than decoration. The lime sealed out rain and kept insects at bay. In time, the white cottages dotted the countryside like pale bones against the green hills, humble but enduring. Across medieval Europe, from the windswept villages of England to the low valleys of France and Germany, the same technique flourished. It required no wealth, only labor and time. The poorest serf could build with it, and for centuries it remained the foundation of peasant architecture. Archaeologists today still uncover traces of these daub walls, the fingerprints of their makers frozen in the clay, a literal impression of history's most overlooked builders. What made wattle and daub remarkable was not its sophistication, but its adaptability. It was simple enough for a farmer to repair with his own hands. When a wall cracked, more mud could be mixed, more dung gathered, more straw added. A home was never finished. It was alive, constantly mended, evolving with the family inside it. In its crude simplicity lay genius. The same mixture that dried in the sun could resist wind and hold warmth in winter. It was breathable, renewable, and sustainable long before those words had meaning. The peasants didn't build for posterity, they built for survival. Yet unknowingly, they mastered an early form of environmental harmony, balancing need with nature in a way that modern builders often forget. And thus, from the tangled sticks and steaming dung, a civilization's most honest architecture was born. Wattle and daub wasn't a symbol of poverty. It was proof that even in hardship, creativity thrives. For when gold was scarce and stone belonged to kings, the poor built with what the earth provided, and they built well enough for history to remember. To the eye of a nobleman, cow dung was filth, an emblem of peasantry and shame. But to the medieval villager, it was something else entirely, a miracle of the earth, both humble and powerful. For them, dung was not waste, it was wisdom. Over centuries of trial and necessity, peasants learned its secrets, long before science could explain them. Fresh dung was rich with fibrous plant material from the cow's slow digestion, which made it naturally cohesive and binding. When mixed with clay, It created a blend that hardened like plaster and resisted cracking as it dried. The straw and fibers intertwined through the mud like sinews, giving the wall flexibility, a living structure that moved rather than shattered. It was this resilience that allowed peasant cottages to survive years of wind and rain, their walls swelling and settling with the changing seasons. What began as filth became function, a transformation born from intimate knowledge of nature. When dried, the mixture of clay and dung formed a thermal barrier. The microscopic air pockets trapped within the fibers held warmth, keeping the bitter cold of winter outside while insulating the fire's fragile heat within. And in summer, those same walls stayed cool, breathing moisture through their porous skin. Peasants did not understand thermodynamics, but they knew, through experience, that dung kept the cold out and the hearth warm. It was the science of survival, discovered by calloused hands and sharpened by hunger. The cow dung's natural enzymes also repelled pests. Flies, beetles, and even mice avoided the hardened daub, as its odor and chemical makeup deterred infestation. This small advantage made a great difference in a world where grain stores and bedding could vanish to vermin overnight. In essence, cow dung served as nature's own defense, sealing the home from the crawling hunger that lurked outside. When the daub dried, its surface took on a leathery strength, neither rock nor soil, but something in between. Rain could not easily erode it, and though it absorbed moisture, it rarely collapsed under it. In flood-prone lands, peasants learned to mix in ash or lime for extra resistance, discovering by instinct what would later become basic chemistry. This was no random craft. It was an evolving science of the common folk. Centuries later, scientists would confirm that dung contains methane-producing bacteria and cellulose fibers that give it extraordinary durability when combined with clay. Modern earth houses and eco-builders have rediscovered what peasants once knew by heart, that organic compounds can make stronger, more sustainable walls than cement. What was once mocked as primitive is now praised as ecological genius. The villagers who built with dung could never have imagined they were early environmentalists. To them, it was simply survival, using what was free and near. Yet, in their crude architecture, they captured the essence of balance between human need and natural order. Each wall stood as an unwritten formula of chemistry, biology, and intuition combined. When the winter wind screamed across the thatched rooftops, those inside their dung and clay homes could feel the difference, the warmth lingering, the draft muffled. It was not beauty that mattered. It was endurance. In the marriage of clay and dung, they had found the alchemy of the poor, a transformation of waste into shelter, of disgust into dignity. And so, behind every brown wall that looked crude to the noble eye, lay centuries of innovation. A testament that necessity is not the mother of invention, but its silent architect. Step through the low wooden doorway, and you enter a world dimly lit and close with breath and smoke. The peasant's home, often just one room shared by an entire family and their animals, was a space where life and survival blended seamlessly. The walls, though rough and brown, stood firm against the biting wind outside. When touched, they felt cool and slightly gritty, like hardened leather. If one leaned close, there was still the faint scent of earth and dung, though dulled now by years of fire smoke and life lived within. In the far corner, the hearth smoldered, its glow the only light in the long winters. There was no chimney. Smoke drifted upward and curled through the thatched roof, staining it black and slowly escaping through gaps in the reeds. The air inside was heavy and thick. Children's eyes watered as they played on the dirt floor, and the elderly coughed softly while spinning wool or mending tools. Yet this was warmth, precious and alive. Every breath, every crackle of wood was proof that the family had survived another day. The furniture was as humble as the walls that enclosed it. A rough-hewn table, benches, and perhaps a small chest for valuables, a wooden spoon, a bit of salt, a needle. The bed was nothing more than straw stuffed into linen sacks, shared by parents and children alike. Sometimes, on the coldest nights, the family goat or a calf was brought indoors to share body heat. It was not comfort in the noble sense, but it was survival's embrace, a cocoon of smoke, warmth, and earth. The walls themselves were more than barriers. They told stories. Every patch and repair bore witness to the seasons. Here, a darker section where rain had leaked through. There, a pale patch where new daub had been applied. The handprints of the builders still showed in the hardened clay, faint imprints of long-dead fingers that once molded their own shelter. For the peasants, these marks were not blemishes. They were signatures of endurance, reminders that the home lived and aged alongside them. And though the nobility mocked such dwellings, calling them hovels, within those small earthen rooms lay the heart of the medieval world. The peasants' homes pulsed with the rhythm of life. Births, laughter, quarrels, prayers whispered in the smoky dark. Bread baked on flat stones, broth simmered in iron pots. Children grew and learned to work the fields their parents tended. The walls absorbed it all, the scent of sweat and grain, the warmth of the fire, the sound of a mother's lullaby. Outside, the noble castles loomed, their stone towers cold and distant. Inside the peasant's home, life was raw but intimate. The fire's light danced across the earthen walls, revealing the small, miraculous details of ordinary existence. A carved wooden cross nailed above the door, a bunch of herbs drying to ward off illness, the faint gleam of a single copper coin saved through months of toil. It was poverty, yes, but it was also persistence, faith, and the unyielding will to make life livable with nothing more than what the soil offered. When storms raged across the countryside, the thatch would tremble and rain would leak through, but the family would huddle together near the fire. The walls, damp yet sturdy, would hold. And when the storm passed, they would rise, clean, patch, and continue. For every crack mended and every wall rebuilt, there was a sense of defiance, a quiet declaration that though they owned nothing, they still belonged to the land. Thus, the dung and clay did more than form a house. They created a sanctuary. Within its humble boundaries, the medieval peasant lived a life unseen by history's chroniclers, yet vital to the world's rhythm. These walls, born from filth, protected love, labor, and lineage. They did not shine like marble, but they endured. And in the end, endurance was worth more than beauty. To the eyes of the noble, the peasant's world was a realm of filth, a lowly existence of mud-caked hands, and the constant stench of manure. They saw the dung-built huts scattered across the countryside as signs of ignorance, symbols of a people too crude to deserve comfort. From their towers of stone, the lords and ladies looked down on the brown homes of the villagers and whispered words like savage and beast. Yet what they called filth, the peasants called survival. What they mocked as crude, the peasants lived as wisdom handed down through generations. In truth, cleanliness was not a universal virtue. It was a luxury of class. The nobles had linen shirts changed daily, servants to scrub their floors, and perfumes to mask the odor of unwashed flesh. But in the village, there were no marble basins or scented oils. Water itself could be scarce, sometimes drawn from wells that froze in winter or grew foul in summer. When the choice was between washing and feeding one's children, Vanity was the first to go. Dung became not a stain of shame, but a mark of practicality. It built the walls that sheltered them, fueled the fire that cooked their bread, and fertilized the fields that kept them alive. Still, the gulf between classes was not only measured in gold, but in smell. Travelers often wrote with disgust about the odor of villages, of manure, mud, and smoke. Chroniclers, often clerics or nobles themselves, exaggerated the filth to underscore their own refinement. To them, the peasants' closeness to earth was a moral failing. Yet that very closeness was what sustained Europe. Every loaf of bread eaten in a castle was born from the mud-caked hands of those who lived in the dung-walled huts below. Inside the cottage, dignity took a different form. A peasant's pride was not in appearance, but in endurance. They cleaned their homes as best they could with straw brooms and rags, sweeping the dirt floor until it looked as smooth as clay. A simple cross carved from oak hung above the hearth, not as decoration but as protection. Women washed their children in wooden tubs when the weather allowed, and men scrubbed their faces before church. For all their poverty, they preserved decency, a quiet, stubborn form of self-respect that no noble could strip away. It was in the small details that dignity survived. A woman might hang dried lavender or sage near the door to sweeten the air. A man might carve patterns into his wooden spoon just to make it his own. Even the act of rebuilding a cracked wall carried pride. Every time a peasant repaired his home, he reaffirmed his worth, not as a vassal, but as a craftsman, a builder, a survivor. The dung that nobles mocked as filth became, in the peasant's hands, a symbol of defiance. You may own the land, but I can still build my home from it. There was hypocrisy, too, in the disdain of the elite. Many of the grand manors and monasteries used similar techniques in their early days. Timber frames, earth mixtures, even animal fibers in their plaster. But time and wealth had allowed them to forget the origins of their comfort. What the poor still did out of need, the rich once did out of the same necessity. History's irony was buried beneath layers of limewash and arrogance. In the end, the class divide was not between the clean and the dirty, but between those who could hide their dirt and those who could not. The peasant's filth was visible, honest, and born of labor. The noble's filth was hidden beneath silks and incense, born of exploitation. One was natural, the other moral. And so, while the noble's perfume faded and their castles crumbled with time, the peasants' walls, those humble mixtures of clay, straw, and dung, remained. They stood as silent monuments to a dignity unacknowledged yet indestructible. The dignity of those who built, endured, and lived with the earth, rather than above it. No home in the medieval countryside was built to last forever. For every wall raised with care, there came a day when the elements would test it, and often destroy it. Fire was the greatest enemy of all. The same hearth that gave warmth and life could, with a stray ember or gust of wind, become a devouring monster. The thatched roofs, dry and eager as tinder, would burst into flame, carrying sparks from one cottage to another until an entire hamlet glowed red against the night. When that happened, there were no engines, no brigades, only shouts, buckets, and desperation. Peasants would form lines to the nearest stream, hurling water in vain at the hungry fire. The air would fill with the cries of beasts and children, the acrid smell of burning thatch, and the awful sound of walls collapsing into the mud. When dawn came, the smoke would rise in silent columns over the blackened earth, and the villagers would stand among the ashes, their homes reduced to smoldering piles of clay and straw. And yet, the story never ended there. They would begin again, because they always did. The women would scrape together what could be saved. Charred timbers, a few unbroken pots, a cross left miraculously untouched. Men would fetch clay from the riverbank, their boots sinking deep into the mire, while children gathered dung and straw. The rhythm of rebuilding began almost before the ruins cooled. With every handful of mud pressed into place, the villagers reclaimed their dignity from the ashes. The same mixture that had burned would now rise again, stronger for the lesson it had endured. If fire was the enemy of heaven, then water was the curse of earth. Floods came without warning, rains that turned paths into rivers, rivers into lakes, and homes into floating wreckage. The daub walls would absorb the water, growing soft and heavy until they slumped like melting wax. The villagers would wade through knee-deep mud to rescue what they could: sacks of grain, tools, animals terrified by the rising current. The smell of rot would linger for days afterward, but so would the determination to rebuild. Each disaster was a cycle, a grim teacher. Peasants learned to raise their floors higher, to dig drainage ditches, to add more straw for strength. They learned how to read the sky, the swollen clouds that meant flood, the fierce, dry winds that foretold fire. Their knowledge was not written in books, but in scars, passed down through calloused hands and wordless understanding. When pests came, rats, weevils, lice, the peasants fought back not with magic but with ingenuity. They smoked out vermin with herbs, sealed holes with clay, and learned which mixtures of dung and ash could repel the smallest intruders. Every threat birthed a new adaptation, a small victory in the endless war between human frailty and the will of nature. And through it all, the community endured. When one home fell, neighbors helped rebuild it. When a storm destroyed a barn, the village shared tools and labor until it stood again. It was not wealth that bound them, but shared survival. A man whose cottage had burned last winter would help another whose walls had just crumbled, knowing that next year the roles might reverse. It was a brotherhood forged in mud and misery, more enduring than any noble's oath. Each new home carried the memory of loss, the faint scent of smoke or the uneven texture where floodwater once soaked the wall. Yet in those imperfections lay a strange kind of grace. The peasants' cottages were not monuments to triumph, but to persistence. They were proof that humanity, though fragile, could always begin again. In every rebuilt wall of clay and dung, there was an unspoken truth. Fire may devour, floods may destroy, but as long as there is earth beneath the feet and dung from the fields, there will always be hands to build anew. Centuries passed, and the world changed around the peasants' humble craft. Stone fortresses gave way to cities of brick, and the old earth-built cottages slowly vanished from the landscape. Yet the legacy of mud and dung never truly died. It simply sank deeper into the memory of the land. Beneath the green hills of England, the farmlands of France, and the river valleys of Germany, archaeologists still uncover the ghostly traces of wattle and daub, fragments of hardened clay, imprinted with straw, and the fingerprints of forgotten builders. Each fragment is a whisper from a world that built with its hands and its hope. What's remarkable is not how crude these structures were, but how well they endured. Some medieval timber-framed houses, their daub still intact between ancient beams, stand to this day. In quiet English villages, centuries-old cottages, whitewashed and quaint, still rest upon walls once mixed with cow dung. Modern passers-by admire their charm without realizing they're walking through the living fossils of peasant ingenuity. What nobles once despised as filth, tourists now photograph as beauty. The wattle and daub method survived well into the 17th and even 18th centuries, outlasting the medieval age itself. As Europe rebuilt after war and plague, This ancient craft remained the foundation of rural life. It was simple, renewable, and endlessly repairable. A technology perfectly suited to a people who had learned that permanence is an illusion, and that the truest strength lies in renewal. Even when bricks and plaster replaced the old mixtures, the logic of the peasant's design persisted: layers, insulation, breathability, and harmony with the land. In time, scholars began to study the science behind what the peasants had known instinctively. They found that the combination of dung, straw, and clay created a structure both flexible and breathable, capable of regulating temperature and humidity naturally. It resisted mold, absorbed carbon, and required almost no waste. Without meaning to, the medieval peasant had crafted one of the earliest forms of sustainable architecture, a balance between human need and environmental respect that modern builders struggle to replicate. Today, in an age of glass towers and concrete jungles, the wisdom of those dirt-stained hands is being rediscovered. Across Europe and beyond, eco-builders and environmental architects have revived the use of natural materials, mud, straw, lime, and even animal dung, to create homes that are warm in winter, cool in summer, and leave almost no scar on the planet. They call it cob building, earth architecture, or eco-daub. But its soul is ancient, its origin unmistakably medieval. And in these modern homes, sleek though they may appear, the echo of the past still lingers: the scent of earth when the walls are first molded, the satisfaction of shaping something with bare hands, the quiet humility of living in harmony with the soil. It is as though, across the centuries, the peasant's wisdom has finally been vindicated. What once drew ridicule has become a model for the future. The story of mud and dung is not only one of architecture, it's a story of continuity. It reminds us that progress is not always upward, but circular. The world that once scorned earth now returns to it, seeking what it had forgotten. That shelter is not measured in grandeur, but in belonging. And so the peasant's craft, born of desperation, shaped by need, and perfected through patience, endures in spirit. The walls that once stood against wind and famine now stand as metaphors: resilience, adaptation, and the quiet genius of those who had nothing yet created everything they needed. Their walls may have crumbled into dust long ago, but the knowledge, the hands, and the dignity behind them remain immortal. For even as centuries pass, the earth remembers, and the legacy of mud and dung continues to breathe through time. In the end, the story of the peasant's dung-built walls is not one of filth or poverty. It is one of profound humanity. To live surrounded by earth was to live in the embrace of nature itself. And though the world has often mocked their simplicity, there was quiet nobility in every handful of mud they lifted. Their homes were not monuments of conquest or wealth, but of survival and belonging. They did not carve their names in stone. They left fingerprints in clay, pressed into the bones of the land that fed them. For the medieval peasant, dignity was never granted by birthright or title. It was earned daily through labor. Every morning they rose before dawn, hands cracked and aching, to shape the same soil that had shaped their ancestors. They did not expect luxury. Their greatest triumph was endurance: a roof that held through the storm, a wall that stood through the winter, a fire that stayed alive till dawn. To modern eyes, their world seems harsh, but to them it was sacred. A balance of toil and gratitude, of filth and faith. In their huts of dung and straw, there lived laughter and love. Children were born on those dirt floors. Mothers sang softly over smoky hearths, and old men told stories of saints and seasons. The walls absorbed it all: the warmth of family, the sound of work and prayer. What nobles called hovels were in truth sanctuaries of life, built by hands that refused to surrender to despair. They may have been poor, but their homes held something no castle could buy: the soul of the land itself. And when time finally claimed those walls, returning them to the soil, it did not erase the spirit that built them. The clay crumbled back into dust, the straw decayed, and even the memory of the builders faded from records. Yet beneath the grass and roots, the remnants of those homes still whisper. They speak of a people who endured without glory, who built not for pride, but for peace. Their legacy lies not in their destruction, but in their quiet continuation. Generation after generation, from one patch of earth to another. Today we live in a world obsessed with progress, yet it is the past that still humbles us. The peasants who built with dung remind us that civilization's foundation is not marble or gold. It is human resilience. It is the wisdom to use what the earth provides, to make from nothing something that shelters, protects, and lasts. Their homes teach us that dignity does not require splendor. It requires only the will to live well, to create with care, and to endure with grace. There is poetry in their craft. What was once dismissed as filthy has become, through time's lens, a symbol of ingenuity. The same dung that disgusted nobles now fascinates architects. The same mud walls once scorned now inspire sustainable design. History has a sense of irony. The poor, who built from waste, may have understood the meaning of balance better than those who ruled them. As the fire of modernity burns hotter, perhaps their wisdom is what we most need to remember: to live with the earth, not above it; to build with care, not excess; to find beauty, not in the perfect, but in the enduring. For the peasants of the Middle Ages, this truth was never theory. It was life itself, and so the story closes not in shame, but in honor. The walls made of dung and straw stand as a testament to the unyielding spirit of humankind. From dirt they came, to dirt they returned, but in between they created homes, families, and futures. In the quiet persistence of their labor lies the purest kind of dignity, one built not from riches or titles, but from earth, patience, and the will to survive.